The question that this paper, which is published in the Tibet Journal recently, is no more and no less than probably the most difficult problem in Tibetan history. Tibetan history is filled with a sense of awe of the growth of the monasteries, of the blessings of the Buddha for the land of Tibet, and the enormous sense of how Tibet should go. And the great the fifth Dalai Lama, gives a tremendous leadership founding the monasteries, the Lhasa ceremony festivals of every year that simply define what Lhasa becomes as a city. However, before 1642, neither the fourth Dalai Lama nor the fifth Dalai Lama had absolute control of Tibet. In my last presentation, I gave the sense that the festivals were not set, the ministers had not been appointed, and so this is a very important period. Among friends here in Dharamsala, this is the period that the Chinese contests as the period in which this encounter of the fifth Dalai Lama with the leader of China was of a different manner. So you will forgive me and excuse me if I cannot solve everything here. But it's always, to me, very important, particularly with staff of the Library of Archives and scholars around, to try to ask the question again. Maybe the place is here because we are not watched by the international community or by others. And so I'm going to propose something very simple. As I proposed in my talk in 2014, which was basically that the monasteries gave to Tibet the fiber of a nation. Sometimes, particularly Western historians of Tibet, do not recognize this. I just came from Punjab, from a very fruitful conversation at the Sikh University. Whenever I come to India, I try to understand how these communities were formed and so forth. If you look at the work of Mervyn Goldstein and others, which are formidable works of the history of Tibet, there is a little bit somehow in the text that I don't agree with. They're looking at Tibet as an agrarian society, which is opening to different models. But the three monasteries which comprised the holiness of Tibet, the purity of Tibet, and who, as I suggested the last time in my paper, in the year 1717, there must be other sources somewhere, either in the occupied Tibet or in our libraries. I have not found them. So this is all incomplete. But in 1717, we are told that only in the city of Lhasa, there were 319,000 monks. And you will not find 319,000 monks in any country which has a monastic system today. Neither you will have it in the monastic order of Hinduism or of Roman Catholicism or within the monasteries today. So therefore, we cannot escape the possibility that there is a part in the history of Tibet we do not understand. And we cannot understand it because simply, in a way, we follow the middle path. And in that path, we try to understand what was written, but there are things that we cannot understand because it happened in a different causation, metaphysical, and sense of life. And therefore, 1642 is a year in which we assumed, with the Western historians, that Tibet had for the first time a full autonomy under the 5th Dalai Lama. So this was the first Dalai Lama that could claim that everybody had allegiance to the Great Fifth. This paper suggests that this came a few years later, not very much later, but a few years later. The challenge then of the administrative center in Sang cannot be avoided. The fights within the nobility and the monasteries was a very real one. The fact that the 5th Dalai Lama then had the help of the Khan to, in a way, fight the advancement into the kingdom of Sang cannot be ignored. In my own research, I will suggest that this doesn't take away any of the greatness of the Great Fifth. On the contrary, it creates a history that for the contemporary world is even more beautiful and more credible. It is not a historiography or a sacred history of a people who are trying to go through their institutions, but it is a great history of people who are trying to find their path. I compare it to the great difficulties I teach in Scotland, and I've lived there for 22 years. I compare it to the great difficulties at the moment we're going to face on the 23rd of June, in which maybe my wife and I will return to a Scotland outside the European Union. Knowing the history of Tibet, God forbid, we stand together as a very strong people. And so therefore, I've had a great sense that the greatness of the fifth relies in that he is able to take the metaphysical sense and guide the events of the time. This is Tibetan historiography. The Great Fifth could be seen in Western history as somebody who didn't have enough strength, military strength, in order to fight against the king of Sang in the historiography of Tibet, and that is the writing of the autobiography and the memoirs of the Great Fifth. The Great Fifth is able, through the mind, to guide the unification of Tibet. And there is a principle here that it is extremely important, and this is what Geshe Lagdor asked me to address. The principle of religion and politics, the chösi nyitrel, in Tibetan politics is something that is quite unique. My official title in St. Andrews is Professor of Religion and Politics. I'm interested in this. So I've done studies in Somaliland, I've studied in classical Hinduism. This is a unique principle. If there are, I'm sure, many scholars among you and people who are translating texts within the library, there is something that has not been explored here. The principle that changes with the Great Fifth, in that somebody who has the political authority can as well claim the divine authority of a metaphysical realm. And so therefore, we are in very difficult waters. So I propose a different reading of the historical sources and the possibility that the 5th Dalai Lama did not have absolute political power, and this was achieved in 1717. When we have the records, then after the death, we have the Mongolian records after the death of Lhasa Khan, in which we see how, in a way, Tibet had been unified. Anybody working on this? I have tried to survey, the secretary and editor will tell me if I did rightly or wrongly. I've tried to find most of the sources available in a way to all of us. There must be other sources somewhere. So, on the 5th, in 1642, on the 5th day of the 4th month of the Tibetan water horse year, in the 11th sexagenary cycle of the Tibetan calendar, the fifth Dalai Lama, the Great Fifth, was enthroned at the Great Audience Hall of Sandrum Tse Castle in Sigatse. This is in Sang. He was raised on the high golden fiercely snow lion throne and invested with the Tibetan leadership, while Wushri Khan and Chopel, son of Raptan for others, the regent, were sitting on lower thrones. This is a very high moment in the history of Tibet. Who was Khan? Khan was the Ho-shoot of the Mongols. He was a 15th generation descendant of Khazar. He was the father who had been 15 generations early the father of Genghis Khan. And he was an Oirat prince, and at the time the recognized unifying leader of the Mongols. So we have history that repeats itself. This event then, a royal event, conferred then the sovereign powers to the fifth Dalai Lama, marked the unification of Tibet, and began a very close cooperation at political level between the Mongolian Khan and the Tibetan Dalai Lama. I could go into details on how in the 11th century the Tibetan calendar changed into a 60-year cycle, and I could expand more on how the third Dalai Lama and the fourth Dalai Lama were dependent on the Khans. Forgive me if I don't do it today. You can read the footnotes. They are very extensive, and I would like, if any of the scholars around here, if you were write to me, maybe something is wrongly interpreted, something is wrongly used. You have the Mongolian sources, the Chinese sources, the Tibetan sources, and so forth. And I will be very curious if this was a good job or not. I'm always conscious that I'm non-Tibetan, and I'm always conscious that my master Geshe Lagdor knows much more than me. And so therefore, please send me some comments. So, the unification of Tibet depends on the Gelug, on this order then that is bestowed with the sense of the virtuous one and the founding then of the Ganden Pa, the Ganden monastery, and the whole sense of the sacredness that comes from this history of monasticism. The three seats, the Densa Sum, the Sendre Gasum, create then the possibility of the purity of Tibet. This is the part that I feel that sometimes Western and European historians have overlooked. Without purity, the Dalai Lama cannot function. Without purity, the monks do not have something to offer. It is the purity that provides then that mighty sense that the king of Tibet, therefore the king of Sang before this period, does not have that purity. This is what makes the possibility of the change. So the figure of the Great Fifth and the figure then of the Mongol ruler Khan fight against the Karmapa, the patron then of the king of Sang. They lost. In very simple historical terms is what happens. But you can defeat a king, you can put another one, you can do it again and again, and this will not create a nation as great as Tibet. So, the military defeat then of the kings of Sang pacified Tibet by force. But the foundations then of Tibet comes from the three major events. The founding then of the Densa Sum, the foundation then of the whole government of Tibet, in which 11 or 12, there is a disagreement, 11 or 12 then very senior monks are taken into the government, and then the festivals of Lhasa. The festival of Lhasa means the recovery of the purity of Tibet every day. Those who were the last time at the talk, you can read that paper in the Tibet Journal, but that was the moment when seating arrangements were done, when there was a change then on the seniority of the monasteries, and in which all, in a sense, the monastic ideals were set institutionally. But without this principle of religion and politics, as well, this would have been a sense in which the three principles of institutional development will not have worked. So the great fifth, and I'm working here with his memoirs. The great fifth reflects on what was the moment, and he suggests that religion, which is then the monasteries, becomes then religion and political affairs joined together in the chösi nyitrel. This is the great fifth ideology: to make a secular and religious leader of a Buddhist Tibet within a feudal project of a larger Mongol empire. The Khan comes to the Dalai Lama, but assumes a different reading of this. Assumes in the Mongolian sources that simply Tibet is going to be the spiritual house of the Mongols. While the great fifth, and that is what he is the great develops this into an independent Tibet. So, in the discussion with the Chinese about the independence or non-independence of Tibet, it is very clear that we could say the moments in which Tibet was independent because there were no foreign armies and so on, but this is the moment of independence. This is the principle that creates the possibility that either ritually and therefore metaphysically and within the political realm, Tibet does not depend on anybody else. So those of you who maybe want to read your own history and want to read the political history, we need to return to this principle. There is the construction, of course, of all the institutions in Lhasa, including the Potala Palace. But the Potala is not constructed as sometimes you see in the historical contemporary commentaries as a palace for a king. The Potala connects within the middle way the possibility that the monasteries and the political powers can work together. The Potala Palace is, of course, the seat of the Buddha, in which through all these many beautiful corridors and these many rooms, you can connect to the heavens. So the Dalai Lama becomes a mixture of Mongolian and Tibetan, Dalai meaning ocean in Mongolian, and Lama meaning a spiritual master in Tibetan. There are many addresses to this point. But however, the ritual title given by the Altan Khan means that he is the great Brahma of the gods. So all this principle becomes very much together. In 1582, Altan Khan died, and his son then, Sengye, invited the third Dalai Lama to visit Mongolia, and we know what the history follows. The fourth Dalai Lama was the only one who was not a Tibetan, and his recognition then managed to seal a very close association between Tibet and Mongolia. The Gelug then made a sharp political move by finding the fourth Dalai Lama in Mongolia, and as a result, they secured their primacy not only in Tibet, but also in Mongolia. Now, let's look then a little bit longer at the institutions for national unification. In a way, if you look at what has been reproduced and brought into Dharamsala, we have these institutions here. And then we have the Association of Southern India with this institution. The first one, then, is the great institution of a Tibet which has one monastic order in a political importance rather than others. This is always a difficult point, but this is what makes the possibility that the monastic orders make a new development within Lhasa, in which the order of the Dalai Lama, the Karmapa, and others is very heavily influenced by the centrality of Lhasa. Without that, I think, and this is just a historian's guess, we will have had another civil war, and the kings of Sun could have again attacked. In a way, even when some of the strife on the Karmapas are the Karmapas who, in their association with the new system over 300 years, create the possibility that the Dalai Lamas can continue unifying Tibet. After the enthronement, then, Khan and the fifth Dalai Lama looked for a place where they could build a fortress from where the leader of Tibet could lead all Tibetans. And therefore, the Potala Palace comes into existence. And there is a change here, which was never, I think, thought in the writings of the fifth. He never thought that this will happen. This is the influence of the Mongolians. The new Tibetan government, then in Lhasa, appoints competent senior advisors, regents of the Tibetan governments who were in charge of administrative affairs, and the whole of Tibet unified through the possibility that the Dalai Lama is left to do the unification in the spiritual realm while keeping a close eye on the regent. You know the difficulty of the regents over the centuries, in that the regents sometimes respond to this unification, some other times the regents are people who step over the line. So the rising importance of the fifth Dalai Lama, and I return to this incident, triggers an invitation from the young Manchu Emperor Shunxi for the Dalai Lama to visit China. The fifth Dalai Lama accepted the invitation and journeyed to China in 1652, arriving in Beijing on the following year. The reason for such invitation were political. They arose out of the Manchu concern for the expansion and alliances of the Mongols with the Tibetans, and the fact that the Eastern Mongols had not yet submitted to Manchu rule. So they were weak at the time, so they decided to invite the fifth Dalai Lama. Sunxi's father, the Emperor Hong Tashi, had in the past sent messages to the Dalai Lama inviting him to visit the Manchu capital of Mukden, an invitation that remained pending because of the emperor's death. On the road to Beijing, the fifth Dalai Lama carried with him an escort of 3,000 Mongols, a fact that was of concern to Sunxi's court. After long deliberations, then the emperor decided to send a large amount of messengers bearing gifts and ordered hundreds of silk banners to be placed outside the north part of the Great Wall. The fifth Dalai Lama entered Beijing, and in January 1653, the emperor and the fifth Dalai Lama shared tea at the imperial palace, with the consequences that there hasn't been a most important cup of tea in the history of humanity. They held hands, and the emperor inquired about the great fifth's health before sitting together with the Dalai Lama's seat being lower than Sunxi's seat. And this is the interpretation that creates all the great problems that we all know about. Was it lower, meaning that he was a vassal and a servant? We who work closely to Tibetan history say no, but this I don't think will ever happen. My remit by Geshe Lagtor was that I will solve this problem. I'm afraid this is beyond my human understanding. So therefore, the fifth Dalai Lama spent several months in Beijing, always afraid of lowland illnesses such as smallpox, but aware that his visit could bring the Dharma to China and that the peaceful coexistence between the Manchu and the Tibetans were at stake. The emperor conferred the title, and I find this probably the most important title that could be given, which maybe suggests that the Dalai Lama was an independent head of state arriving in China. You do not confer to a lower guest tremendous title. Titles were very important at that time. So the immutable Vajradhara, Lama of the ocean, who resides in happiness, most virtuously in the western abode of the gods, and who has brought all beings beneath heaven under one religion by authority of the Buddha. To me, that says this is an independent ruler. The custom of conferring these titles was common within the Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1653. And therefore, this was not the custom of the Manchus. And so if anybody would like to have a good fight with the Chinese about these titles, I think this is the title to fight about. The Manchus could not have given the title, they were not giving titles to others. We can discuss that. However, the fifth Dalai Lama was very much concerned about the arrival of the Dharma. So he wrote then, I caused all the laity and clergy in the encampment and the Chinese, Tibetan, and Mongolian monks, both inside and outside the palace, to be guided. I wrote, says the fifth, in the manner required, a monastic charter to which the Chinese and Mongol monks and nuns could adhere. Once again, if you were an unwelcome guest, you will not be making monastic charts within another empire. So Lhasa became a place where foreigners visited and where trading posts were established. As I said in my previous talk, by the 17th century, Armenians established a trading post, Mongols visited Lhasa in connection to diplomatic missions, and foreign artisans were employed as painters, sculptors, and builders, while Indians also visited the newly erected fortification at Lhasa, while the Jesuit father Ippolito Desideri remained in Lhasa, translating Tibetan texts into Italian and Tibetan texts comparing Buddhism and Christianity. I would have loved, please tell Geshe Lagdo that I really was looking forward to him to be here. I shall return next year because I gave him the memoirs of Father Desideri when I gave the last time, and I wanted him to read them and for us to have a discussion. So that is pending. Neighboring empires, traders, and even invaded armies could negotiate political affairs with the fifth Dalai Lama through his regent and council. And therefore, this is a very golden period, but a period in which, unlike some historians which suggest that Lhasa was closed to foreigners, it wasn't. It was a place visited and so forth. Now, let me make a few remarks here as time goes on. One of the great problems of this time for history and for Tibet were the fights within the Gelug. Maybe it's good that we have one representative, but maybe it's good that Geshe Lagdo is not here. The fights of the Gelug were not only about their rights of being kept so that they could pray, their access to lands, their access to food, their access to the government, but on the other hand, there was a great strife within on where then monastic institutions were going. Some of the Gelug were not happy with this principle of religion and politics. Some others were. As I said, we will always be a bit handicapped in a sense of our archives because of the historical events we all know. So we don't have a full library in which we could say this is what was happening. But there was enormous trouble. the comment of Geshe Lakdor about this was, well, this hasn't ceased today. And there was tremendous trouble in Drepung and Sera Monastery during the Great Prayer in 1630, 1669, and 1675. The trouble was about the sitting, and the trouble was about that some monks would not hear the fifth Dalai Lama speak. So the fifth Dalai Lama was very clear in his instructions to monks, and you can see the whole unification by a very wise leader. He writes, in front shall be the Drepung Pa, behind them facing west in 6 lines only Sera monks, the Meroshide monastery. In back of them a combination of Sera and Drepung along with various groups of monastic communities from all sects. All of them were represented in some kind of orderly manner. The Great Prayer started on the 4th day of the first month of the Tibetan year and culminated on the 6th day within 3 main prayer services, 2 of them about 3 hours each before dawn to midday and another in the afternoon. The fifth Dalai Lama produced a substantial body of 25 volumes addressing different aspects of Buddhism that, together with the corpus produced by his regent, aimed at unifying religious thought and political practice in Tibet. In 1679, the fifth Dalai Lama abdicated and left political powers to Sangye Gyatso, dying 3 days later on the 7th of April, 1682. His death was not disclosed until April 1695, and his mummified body taken out of his mortuary casket. In November 1695, the public announcement of his death was finally made, coincided with the announcement of his reincarnation in the 6th Dalai Lama and the enthronement of the new spiritual leader of Tibet on the 8th of December of the same year. So let me make 4 comments and then open for a few questions, comments, whatever. The first historiographical observation from the Tibetan sources is that the enthronement of the fifth Dalai Lama was an expression of national identity that had already been developed by the creation of national rituals of Buddhist observance at the time of Tsongkhapa, and coinciding then with the development of the Sri University Monastery, the Sri seats, during the 15th century. However, those national rituals only became dominant within the monastic and political history of centralized Tibet because of the alliance between the Mongols and the Gelug. The military attacks by the Mongols against the enemy of the Gelug in Sang, Kham, and Amdo. The second historiographical observation points to the dominance then of Gush Khan and his descendants on Tibet. They retained the title of kings of Tibet, and this is where I say this is more complex than just the fifth Dalai Lama. They returned the title of kings of Tibet until 1717, devolving powers of kingship and to the fifth Dalai Lama from 1642 to the fifth Dalai Lama's regent, Desi Sangye Gyatso, who died in 1705, and later to Khan's grandson, Lhasa Khan, from 1705 to 1717. Lhasa Khan became interested in Tibetan affairs again, but he encountered opposition from the regent in Lhasa, who sought help from the Chinese emperor in order to keep the 6th Dalai Lama in office. This is a great difficulty. Some of the writers have talked about the unwiseness of the 6th Dalai Lama on bringing the Chinese one in. However, with Lhasa Khan's death in 1717, the actual influence of the Khans within Lhasa ended and reinforced the absolute power of the Dalai Lama through their regents. However, it is not possible to extrapolate from the historical sources an absolute monarchical power on Tibetan political affairs by the Dalai Lamas before 1717. The third historiographical observation points to the fifth Dalai Lama's claims to an even higher authority in the political realm because of his 1653 visit to the Manchu king court in Beijing and the conferring by the emperor then of the extraordinary title that he gave to the fifth Dalai Lama. A fourth historical observation points to a disputing understanding of royal kingship and monastic descent within the aftermath of the public recognition of the fifth Dalai Lama and his appointment as the political leader of Tibet in 1642. It is a very interesting detail. In his History of Tibet, the fifth Dalai Lama omitted any mention of himself as the ruler of Tibet, and instead described the honor and homage paid by authorities in Tibet towards Altar Khan. He calls Altar Khan in his memoirs the king of the three parts of Tibet, and he who had set up the white umbrella of his laws on the peak of the world. The issue was not a religious one, but I think an administrative one. It was understood that the ruler of a land collected taxes from his subjects, and the fifth Dalai Lama did. Further, the fifth Dalai Lama wrote, "The people as far as the king of Yang paid taxes in money and endlessly sought to bow down to him respectfully." It is therefore within other later writings that he asserted his authority over Tibet, particularly in order to make official appointments and in order to decide on disputes and borders. For example, this assertion of authority is present on his edict of 1680 concerning a stable and safe border on the direct route from the plains of Assam to the Tibetan plateau, the so-called Monjul corridor, later disputed by Tibet, China, Bhutan, and India. The fifth Dalai Lama opened his edicts as follows. The discourse of he who is called by command of the emperor, the Huang Ti, the immutable Vajradhara, Lama of the ocean who resides in happiness, most virtuously in the western abode of the gods, and who has brought all beings beneath heaven under one religion by authority of the Buddha. That title is used very much later as given by the Chinese emperor. Let me finish with a very short conclusion. It is possible to argue that the fifth Dalai Lama developed the principle of chösi nyitrel, religion and politics together, because his own reading and understanding of history could not depart completely from a Tibetan religious reading of history. Thus, Hugh Richardson argued consistently that Tibetans see their history solely in terms of their religion. Once the unification of Tibet had taken place, the fifth Dalai Lama seems to have broken this principle of religion and politics by returning to his own religious duties. In his writings, the fifth Dalai Lama assumed that the Khans were the political rulers of Tibet, lawful rulers because they had converted to Gelugpa Buddhism, and they had protected the Gelug against other Mongols and other Tibetan sects. The unification of Tibet could be assumed as the pacification and centralization of Tibet under the principle of religion and politics together, whereby the fifth Dalai Lama was the assumed political and religious leaders. In practice, and from 1642, the Dalai Lama continued being the religious leader of the Gelug and of a pacified Tibet, while the political leadership remained in the hands of the Khans, who devolved such power to the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama, in turn, devolved such power to the Tibetan regent, returning to his role as a central spiritual leader of Tibet, and the embodiment of the Buddha of compassion.